The American tank everyone mocked, until Rommel's crews stared dying. Part 1. The Wedding Cake of War. In the spring of 1942, the sands of North Africa were a graveyard for the British Empire. The German Afrika Korps, led by the legendary general Erwin Rommel, was tearing through the desert like a hot knife through butter. Rommel's Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were faster, more reliable, and carried guns that could outrange anything the British had in their arsenal. The British were desperate. They turned to the arsenal of democracy, the United States. But America wasn't ready. They didn't have a modern tank. In a panic, American engineers rushed a design into production that looked like something out of a science fiction nightmare. It was called the M3 Lee, and from the moment it arrived on the docks of Egypt, the mockery began. The three-story monstrosity, the British tankers took one look at the M3 Lee and were horrified. While modern tanks were designed to be low to the ground and sleek, the M3 Lee stood over 10 feet tall. It was massive, bulky, and awkward. The British soldiers jokingly nicknamed it the Burning Grave or the Rolling Wedding Cake because of its tiered three-story design. But the biggest joke was the weaponry. Instead of putting the main gun in a rotating turret on top, the Americans had bolted a massive 75mm cannon into the side of the hull. This meant that to aim the big gun, the driver had to turn the entire tank. On top of that sat a smaller turret with a 37mm gun, and on top of that sat a machine gun cupola. It was a tank designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. German intelligence officers who saw photos of the M3 laughed, calling it a clumsy American toy that would be easy prey for Rommel's professional crews. Rommel's confidence General Rommel himself was unimpressed. He believed the Americans were amateurs in armored warfare. His crews were veterans of the lightning wars in Poland and France. They knew how to maneuver, how to flank, and how to destroy high-profile targets. To the Germans, the M3 Lee was a gift. It was a target so tall you could see it from miles away across the flat desert floor. Rommel ordered his panzers to engage the new American tanks at the Battle of Gazala, expecting a quick and easy slaughter. He thought he was facing a weak, outdated machine. He didn't realize that inside that awkward, tall hull was a secret that was about to change the math of the Desert War forever. The 75mm secret. The Germans had one major advantage in 1942. Their guns could hit the British tanks before the British could hit back. The British tanks mostly carried 2-pounder guns, which were like pea shooters against German armor. But the M3 Lee carried a monster. That side-mounted 75mm gun wasn't just big. It was powerful. It fired a high-explosive shell that could shatter a German tank from over 1,000 yards away, a distance the Germans thought was safe. As the sun rose over the Gazala line, Rommel's panzers charged forward, confident and fast. They saw the wedding cakes sitting on the horizon. They waited for the Americans to panic and run. Instead, the desert exploded. The shock of the first contact. The first German crews to die didn't even know they were in range. A single shot from an M3 Lee struck a leading Panzer III, turning it into a fireball instantly. Then another. And another. The German radio net went into a frenzy. They are hitting us. From where? How? For the first time in the war, the Germans were being outgunned by a tank they had spent months mocking. The M3 Lee wasn't a joke anymore. It was a long-range executioner. The monstrosity was proving that in the desert, looks don't matter, only the size of your punch does. Erwin Rommel looked through his binoculars and saw his invincible panzers burning in the sand. The Desert Fox had just realized that the Americans hadn't sent a toy. They had sent a Titan. Part 2. The Shock at Gazala, May 27, 1942. The North African sun beat down on the Gazala line, a series of fortified boxes stretching across the Libyan desert. The British 8th Army sat waiting, their morale low. For months, they had watched their tanks shatter like glass against the superior range of the German Panzers. But tucked away in the back of the British formations, were 200 new arrivals. They were tall, they were strange, and their crews were still learning how to drive them. They were the American-made M3 Grants. The British tankers looked at these towering machines with suspicion. They hated the height. They hated that the main gun was stuck in the side of the hull. But they were about to find out that inside this monstrosity was the power to break the Desert Fox, Rommel's trap snaps. General Erwin Rommel launched his Operation Venice with lightning speed. He swept his panzers around the southern flank of the British lines, aiming to encircle and destroy the entire 8th Army in one blow. The German 21st Panzer Division led the charge. They were the elite. Their commanders were arrogant. They had spent the last year bullying British tanks that couldn't hit anything beyond 600 yards. As the German tanks crested a ridge, they saw a group of British tanks sitting in the open desert. To the Germans, they looked like easy targets, big, clumsy boxes silhouetted against the bright morning sky. The German commanders laughed over their radios. They called the M3 South clumsy barn doors. They closed the distance to 1,000 yards, confident that they were still in the safety zone, where the British guns couldn't reach them. The mile-long punch. Inside the M3 Grants, the American-trained crews were sweating. The temperature inside the tanks topped 120 degrees. The gunners gripped the handwheels of the 75mm sponson guns. Target in sight. Range 1,200 yards. The command was given. For the first time in the North African War, the desert didn't echo with the pop of a small British gun. It roared with the thunder of an American heavy cannon. The first German Panzer III was hit squarely in the turret. The impact was so violent that the entire turret was ripped off the hull, spinning into the sand like a discarded toy. Seconds later, another Panzer erupted into a pillar of black smoke. The German formation ground to a halt. They were in shock. They were being destroyed by tanks they hadn't even reached yet. The safety zone had disappeared. Panic on the radio. The German radio net exploded in chaos. Achtung! Achtung! The tank commanders screamed. The Tommy has a new gun. It is a 75. Repeat, they have 75s. For the German crews, this was a nightmare realized. They were used to being the hunters. Now they were the ones being picked off from a distance. Every time they tried to maneuver, another 75mm shell would find its mark, punching through their front armor as if it were made of tin. Even more terrifying was the high explosive shell. The M3 could fire a shell that didn't just punch a hole. It exploded upon impact. It was devastating to the German anti-tank gunners who were trying to set up their deadly 88mm guns. The M3 was literally blowing the German support teams to pieces before they could fire a single shot. The wedding cake fights back. The Germans tried to use their classic flanking maneuvers, but the M3 had another surprise. While the big 75mm gun handled the long-range work, the smaller 37mm gun in the top turret was constantly barking at any lighter targets that tried to get close. The M3 was a mobile fortress. It could engage two different targets at two different ranges at the exact same time. Rommel himself was forced to adjust his plans. He realized his panzers were facing a heavy tank that could match his best armor. The American toy had just turned the Battle of Gazala into a brutal, grinding slugfest. The price of arrogance. By the end of the first day of fighting, the 21st Panzer Division had lost dozens of its best tanks. The desert was littered with the burning husks of German machines that had never even gotten a shot off. The British soldiers who had mocked the M3 just days before were now cheering. They patted the hot, oily hulls of their Grants and called them the savior of the desert. The M3 Lee was still tall. It was still awkward. And it was still strange looking. But as the sun set over the bloody sands of Gazala, nobody was laughing anymore. The monstrosity had proved that it was the only thing standing between Erwin Rommel and the Suez Canal. The wedding cake had been invited to the party, and it was the only one left standing. Part 3. The Desert Fox Strikes Back. General Erwin Rommel was a man who learned from his bruises. After the initial shock at the Gazala line, where his panzers were shredded by the M3's 75mm gun, the Desert Fox did what he did best. He adapted. Rommel ordered his mechanics to recover every knocked-out M3 Grant they could find. He spent hours walking around these steel giants, measuring their height and studying the placement of their guns. He wasn't looking at what made the tank strong. He was looking for the crack in its soul. It didn't take long for him to find it. The M3 Lee was a tank of contradictions. It had the heart of a lion, but the body of a target. And Rommel was about to teach the Allies a lesson in the brutal physics of desert warfare. The tallest target in the world, the first thing Rommel noticed was the height crisis. In the flat, featureless desert, being tall is a death sentence. The M3 stood over 10 feet high. This meant that a German gunner could spot an M3 coming over a ridge miles before the M3 could even see the German. But there was a more technical problem. Most tanks use a tactic called hull down. They hide their body behind a sand dune, leaving only the small armored turret exposed to fire. Because the M3's main 75mm gun was mounted low in the hull, not in the turret, the M3 couldn't play this game. To fire its big gun, the M3 had to drive its entire massive 10-foot-tall body over the ridge. It was like a giant standing on a chair to fire a pistol. It was a target that Rommel's 88mm anti-tank gun simply could not miss. The dead zone. Rommel's next discovery was the Sponson's blind spot. Because the 75mm gun was bolted into the right side of the hull, it had a very limited field of fire. It could only swing 15 degrees to the left or right. If a German Panzer could maneuver to the M3's left side, the big American gun was useless. The M3 driver would have to stop, put the tank in gear, and turn the entire 30-ton machine just to aim. Rommel issued new orders to his panzer commanders. Do not fight them head-on, circle them, get to their left. Stay in the shadow of their big gun. The desert suddenly became a deadly dance. The panzers used their superior speed to outturn the M3 south. The Allied crews found themselves frantically spinning their tanks in the sand, trying to bring their big guns to bear while German shells hammered into their exposed sides. The horror of the rivets as the battles intensified throughout the summer of 1942. A new hidden horror emerged inside the M3. Unlike German tanks, which were welded together, the early M3 South were held together by steel rivets. When a German shell hit the outside of an M3, even if it didn't punch through the armor, the shockwave would cause the internal rivets to snap. These steel bolts would fly off like high-velocity bullets inside the tank, ricocheting off the walls and killing or wounding the crew in a storm of jagged metal. The crews began to fear the rivet shower as much as the German shells themselves. The burning grave nickname that the British had given the tank started to feel tragically accurate. The final stand at Alam el Halfa by late August, Rommel made one last, desperate push toward the Nile at a place called Alam el Halfa. He threw everything he had at the British lines. The M3 Grants were dug in, used now as fixed pillboxes because their height made them too vulnerable to move. It was a brutal, stationary duel. The M3 South used their 75mm guns to create a wall of fire, while Rommel's panzers tried to find a gap. In the end, the M3 South held the line, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of wedding cakes were left burning in the sand. The Allied commanders realized that the M3 had served its purpose. It had stopped Rommel when no other tank could, but its time was over. The sunset of a stopgap, the M3 Lee was never meant to be the hero of the war. It was a stopgap, a temporary fix designed in a panic to hold the door shut until a real tank could be built. As the Battle of El Alamein approached, new ships began to arrive at the docks of Egypt. They were carrying a new machine one that was lower, faster, and had a 75mm gun that could rotate 360 degrees. It was called the M4 Sherman. The M3 Lee had bought the Allies the time they needed. It had taken the hits, it had survived the mockery, and it had bled the Afrika Korps white. As the Shermans rolled off the transport ships, the wedding cake quietly stepped aside, its job done, and its place in history secured by the blood of the men who fought in the tallest tank in the world. Part 4. The Russian Revenge. By late 1941, the Soviet Union was bleeding. The German Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, and the Red Army's tank corps had been decimated. In a desperate bid to stay in the war, Joseph Stalin accepted thousands of American tanks under the Lend-Lease program. Among them was the M3 Lee. When the Soviet crews first saw the M3, they were speechless. They were used to the T-34, a sleek, low-profile machine built for one thing: survival. Now they were being handed a towering 3-story steel box that looked like a Victorian apartment building. The Russians didn't see a wedding cake, they saw a target. And on the brutal battlefields of the Eastern Front, where the fighting was closer and more savage than anywhere else on Earth, the M3 Lee was about to earn a reputation that would go down in infamy. 7 men, 1 coffin. The Soviet version of the M3 Lee carried a crew of 7 men. That is 7 lives packed into a single vehicle. The Russian soldiers quickly realized the math of the Eastern Front was against them. The German anti-tank gunners, equipped with high-velocity 50mm and 75mm guns, couldn't miss a tank as tall as the Lee because of the M3's riveted construction, the same flaw Rommel had exploited in Africa. A single hit would send steel bolts flying through the interior like shrapnel. With 7 men crowded inside, a single shell often meant 7 casualties. The Soviet crews began to call the M3 the Grob dla Semerich Bratyev. Translated, it means a grave for 7 brothers. It was a dark, cynical joke that reflected the terrifying reality of being an American tanker in a Russian war. The gasoline nightmare. There was another problem that terrified the Soviet crews: the fuel. Most Soviet tanks, like the T-34, ran on diesel. Diesel is hard to ignite. But the American M3 Lee used a high-octane gasoline aircraft engine. In the middle of a burning city or a dry wheat field, the M3 was a rolling fire hazard. One well-placed German shot, or even a Molotov cocktail thrown from a window, could turn the M3 into a towering inferno in seconds. The Soviet tankers, who were used to the rugged reliability of their own machines, felt like they were sitting on a ticking time bomb. The rubber and the mud the Eastern Front was a landscape of extremes. In the spring, the ground turned into a sea of waist-deep mud called the Rasputitsa. In the winter, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The M3 Lee struggled. Its tracks were padded with rubber to protect American roads, but in Russia, that rubber was a disaster. On frozen hills, the rubber pads acted like ice skates, causing the 30-ton tanks to slide uncontrollably into ditches. Even worse, during the street fighting in places like Stalingrad, the heat from burning buildings would melt the rubber off the tracks, leaving the tank paralyzed in the middle of a kill zone. The Soviet mechanics were forced to weld steel teeth onto the tracks just to keep the machines moving. The hidden firepower. But despite all the complaints, and despite the nicknames, the M3 Lee had one thing the Soviets desperately needed: that side-mounted 75mm gun. In 1942, many Soviet tanks were still light T-60s or T-70s that couldn't scratch a German Panzer. The M3 Lee, however, could punch. In the defensive battles around the Caucasus and the approaches to Stalingrad, the M3 South were used as mobile pillboxes. The Soviet commanders learned to bury the M3 South in the ground, leaving only the guns exposed. In this hull-down position, the M3's height was hidden, and its 75mm cannon became a deadly ambush weapon. At the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, hundreds of M3 Lees were still in the front lines. They fought with a desperation that defined the Eastern Front. They took the hits, they burned, and they died. But they held the line while the Soviet factories worked 24 hours a day to build the 34 85s that would eventually win the war. The final verdict, the M3 Lee was never a favorite in Russia. It was too tall, too hot, and too dangerous. But to the Red Army, it was a bridge. It was the machine that filled the gap when the Soviet Union was at its weakest point. The grave for 7 brothers may have been a cruel nickname, but for thousands of Soviet tankers, that grave was the only thing standing between them and a German bayonet. As the war turned and the Red Army began its long march to Berlin, the M3 Lees were slowly retired, replaced by newer American Shermans and Soviet heavy tanks. But the wedding cake of the desert had left its mark in the snows of Russia. It was an ugly, awkward, and misunderstood giant that fought for a country that hated it, and it did its job until the very end. Part 5. The Jungle Fortress. By 1944, the M3 Lee was considered an antique on the battlefields of Europe. It was too slow for the Blitzkrieg and too tall for the hedgerows of France. But thousands of miles away, in the emerald green hell of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, the wedding cake was preparing for its final act. The Imperial Japanese Army had a very different philosophy of war than the Germans. They didn't have heavy Tiger tanks or long-range 88mm guns. Instead, they relied on invisible bunkers, deep tunnel systems, and light, thin-skinned tanks that could move through the mud. For years, the Japanese had terrorized Allied infantry in the jungle. They felt safe behind 3 feet of teak wood and reinforced earth. They believed no tank could climb the steep, muddy ridges of the Arakan Mountains. They were about to meet the American-made giant that didn't care about the mud, the mountains, or the unbreakable bunkers of the Emperor. The ultimate mismatch when the M3 Lee encountered Japanese armor. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The standard Japanese tanks, like the Type 95 Hago, were tidy. They weighed only 7 tons and had armor so thin that a heavy machine gun could sometimes punch through it. When these tankettes ran into the 30-ton M3 Lee, it was like a bicycle hitting a freight train. The American 37mm gun in the top turret was more than enough to destroy any Japanese tank from a mile away. But the Japanese rarely even got that close. The M3's side-mounted 75mm gun would fire a high-explosive shell that would literally blow the light Japanese tanks apart, leaving nothing but scrap metal in the mud. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese realized they were no longer the predators. There was a new king of the jungle. The bunker buster, the real strength of the M3 Lee in the Pacific wasn't its ability to kill tanks, it was its ability to destroy fortresses. The Japanese were masters of invisible bunkers. They would dig into the roots of giant trees, creating machine gun nests that were impossible for infantry to see or hit with grenades. The M3 Lee was the perfect solution. Because it was so tall, the commander could often look over the top of the jungle scrub to spot the hidden positions. Once a bunker was found, the M3 would park just 50 yards away. At that range, the 75mm gun was like a sniper rifle. The crew would fire point-blank into the bunker openings. The massive high-explosive shells would collapse the tunnels and incinerate the defenders. The Japanese soldiers, who had never seen such concentrated firepower, began to call the M3 the Moving Mountain. The Battle of the Peaks, Kohima and Impal. The M3's greatest moment came during the defense of India, at the legendary battles of Kohima and Impal. The Japanese had surrounded the Allied forces on a series of steep, jagged hills. The British and Australian crews did the impossible. They drove their M3 Lees up slopes that were 45 degrees steep. They used the tank's massive horsepower to crawl up mud-slicked ridges that were thought to be tank-proof. When the M3 South reached the summits, they looked down into the Japanese trenches. From their high vantage point, the M3 South used their multiple guns to sweep the hillsides clean. The Japanese infantry, who had no heavy anti-tank weapons, could do nothing but watch as the rolling wedding cakes crushed their positions one by one. The M3 Lee, the tank everyone had mocked for being too tall, was now using that height to dominate the mountain peaks of Asia. The multitasking warrior in the chaos of jungle fighting. The M3's strange design finally made sense. Often, a tank would be attacked from the front by a bunker and from the side by suicide squads carrying satchel charges. Because the M3 had 2 separate turrets and multiple machine guns, it could fight in every direction at once. The side gun would blast the bunker, while the top turret would spin around to spray the jungle floor with machine gun fire. It was a self-contained fortress that could protect itself in the 36-degree reality of a jungle ambush. By the time the war ended in 1945, the M3 Lee had fought on 3 continents. It had survived the desert, the snow, and the jungle. It had been called a failure and a coffin, but it had outlasted many of the tanks that were supposed to be its superior. The legacy of the ugly duckling, the M3. Lee was the ugly duckling of World War II. It was a desperate design born from a desperate time. It was tall, awkward, and technically flawed. But history is not written by the prettiest machines. It is written by the ones that show up when the world is on fire. The M3 Lee showed up. It held the line in Egypt when Rommel was at the gate. It held the line in Russia when Moscow was burning. And it broke the back of the Japanese army in the mountains of Burma. As the last M3, Lees were retired and sent to the scrap heaps. They left behind a legacy of iron and grit. They proved that with a big enough gun and a brave enough crew, even a rolling wedding cake can become a legend of the battlefield. The tank everyone mocked had the last laugh. Because when the smoke cleared, the M3 Lee was still standing and its enemies were dust. Part 6. The Final Verdict. By the end of 1945, the world was a different place. The thunder of cannons had faded, replaced by the quiet work of rebuilding. In scrap yards from the deserts of Egypt to the steppes of Russia and the jungles of Burma, thousands of M3 Lees sat rusting in the sun. To a casual observer, these tanks looked like relics of a confused past. They were tall, they were awkward, and they were already being replaced by the next generation of steel monsters. But history has a way of hiding the truth beneath a layer of rust. The M3 Lee was never meant to be the perfect tank. It was the missing link. It was the bridge that the Allied powers crossed to get from the brink of defeat to the dawn of victory. Today, we look at the final verdict on the machine that everyone mocked until the world depended on it. The mother of the Sherman. The greatest legacy of the M3 Lee isn't what it did on the battlefield, but what it allowed to happen in the factories. American engineers knew the M3 was a temporary fix. While the Lee was out in the desert taking hits from Rommel, the designers back in Detroit were using its chassis to build the legendary M4 Sherman. The Sherman used the same engine, the same transmission, and the same reliable lower hull as the M3 Lee. Because the M3 had already worked out the bugs in the desert, the Sherman was able to enter production with almost no mechanical flaws. Every victory won by a Sherman tank in France, Germany, and the Pacific was built on the mechanical bones of the M3 Lee. Without the wedding cake, the Easy 8 would never have existed. The School of Hard Knocks, the M3 Lee was also the greatest teacher the American and British tank corps ever had. Before the M3, Allied tankers had no experience with heavy multi-gun operations. They didn't understand the logistics of moving 30-ton machines across thousands of miles of ocean. The M3 forced them to learn. It taught them how to coordinate 75mm fire with infantry movements. It taught them the importance of maintenance in extreme environments. The crews who survived the M3 Grad in North Africa became the elite commanders who led the invasion of Normandy. They took the hard lessons learned in the tallest tank in the world and used them to outmaneuver the Nazis in the final years of the war. The versatile veteran, even when it was retired from the front lines, the M3 Lee refused to stop serving. Its chassis was so rugged and reliable that it was converted into dozens of specialized vehicles. It became the M7 Priest, a self-propelled howitzer that provided devastating fire support for the rest of the war. It became the M31 recovery vehicle, A massive steel crane on tracks that pulled broken tanks out of the mud of Italy and the snow of the Ardennes. In Australia and India, the M3 remained a frontline hero until the very last day of the war. While the rest of the world moved on to newer designs, these soldiers clung to their grants because they knew that when the jungle got thick and the enemy got desperate, the M3's 75mm gun was the only thing that would never let them down. A global soldier. Take a moment to consider the map of the world in 1943. You would find the M3 Lee fighting in the mountains of Tunisia, the streets of Stalingrad, the islands of the Pacific, and the borders of India. No other tank in history had to perform in such a wide variety of climates and cultures. It was a truly global soldier. It was built in America, funded by the British, and bled in by Russians, Australians, and Indians. It was the ultimate symbol of the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't perfect, but it was there when the world was on the line. The final verdict: so was the M3 Lee a failure? If you judge a tank by its height or its looks, the answer is yes. But if you judge a tank by the lives it saved and the battles it won when no other weapon was available, the M3 Lee is one of the most successful designs in military history. It was the right tank at the exactly right, desperate time. It stood tall when everyone else was hiding. It took the ridicule of its enemies and the skepticism of its friends, and it answered them all with the roar of its 75mm gun. The next time you see an M3 Lee in a museum, don't laugh at its wedding cake turrets or its awkward side gun. Look at the steel, look at the rivets, and remember that this was the machine that stopped the Desert Fox, held the line at Stalingrad, and crushed the bunkers of the Pacific. The M3 Lee didn't just fight a war. It bought the world the time it needed to win. And for that, the monstrosity deserves our highest respect. The legend of the M3 Lee is the legend of the underdog who never backed down.